Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the incredible, indeed eerie similarity between the Soviet Russian communist attempts and their blueprint for re-engineering society, Russian society in this case, but their re-engineering of society, and how similar it is to the globalist attempts, ones that are going, gathering a pace here and really moving forward, as they would see it at least, to re-engineer Western society. For the globalist projects. Now, just a little bit of history. In 1917, Russia was a 85% agrarian society and 15% industrial, and it's a nation of vast natural resources, everything, iron ore, gold, zinc, oil. I mean, you name it, they've got it there. So it's again very, very resource rich. They were just starting to sort of really, experience industrial takeoff when the First World War came. But even though they had a population, almost four and a half times that of say Britain's population, the British economy was several times larger than the Russian economy. So, but anyway, in 1917, a political party that was very Marxist in its structure, called the Bolsheviks, seized power by revolution in Russia, and declared a Marxist socialist republic. And that was in 1917. The leading lights back in the day were Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, also known as Liev Schreiber, and Bukharin, Malenkov, Litvinov, and Stalin was a bit player at the time, but he was around. And they were determined to create this socialist paradise along the lines of the writings and proclamations of Karl Marx. So now their key to re-engineering society was, well, there was a number of things. Firstly, they would outlaw all private property. There was no such thing as private property. And this wasn't that big a deal actually in Russia, because the lands that were owned by the aristocrats, which were vast, there weren't that many aristocrats in the overall scheme of things. Many of them fled, of course. The middle class was really very small. It was getting bigger, but it was quite small. So the Soviets seized the estates and the lands of the aristocrats, and they turned the aristocrats' farmland into, collective farms and that sort of thing, or gave the plots to the peasants. The big buildings that were owned by the aristocrats were turned over and became things like schools or museums, or the political party heavies took them as their own holiday houses and things like that. The political party heavies, they looked after themselves. They went and got the big fancy houses on the lake and the holiday homes down on the Black Sea. So they became the new aristocracy in effect, even though they didn't walk around with the diamonds and jewels and the gilded carriages that the former Russian aristocrats had. They eventually shot the Tsar, the emperor, and his family, and killed them. So there was a civil war which ended around during 1921. So 1920, so the end of 1921 into 1922, the communist government, the Marxist government, now has a sort of a real opportunity to go hard at it and create this socialist, communist, Marxist society. Now they took away the private property, so that's fine. For the moment, they left the bigger, more successful farmers called the kulaks. They left them in place, and they wanted to move people from the rural areas to the cities. So they had this idea they had to industrialize very quickly, and create a lot of factories. Now, they certainly create a lot of factories. Whether they exist in reality or on paper is another thing, but you could see the ideological bent in the communists. It's all very well to have a Marxist society sort of in theory or on paper, but it's very different to put it into practice. So we find that they zigzagged and somersaulted, went forward, went back, went sideways, went back again, changed this. And not so much learning from experience, but more flailing sort of wildly, and really the entire cost of industrializing and changing to a communist society came from millions upon millions upon millions of deaths, whether it be starvation or being sent to prison camps or whatever. Also, there was an interesting thing here, which draws parallel with, say, Black Lives Matter or Antifa today. There was a view that lawlessness, just on its own, wasn't a threat to the state. They viewed the communist state as any threat to the communist ideal, the Marxist utopia. Any threat to that was deemed as dangerous, and they had a secret police that had sweeping arbitrary powers to arrest people, detain them, imprison them, and so on, for thought crimes. In effect, you're not so they would have target groups that they perceived were a threat to the ideology of the Marxist utopia, and those people were relentlessly persecuted and spied on, arbitrarily arrested, arbitrarily accused, arbitrarily imprisoned, and dragged through show trials and so on. So if you're an ideological sort of potential ideological enemy, then you really had no rights, or your rights were severely reduced. So if you're in any sort of contest, of any sort of legal contest with anyone else, you would lose, because you really had no standing given you were ideologically impure. Now, this is really how straight white males are viewed in the West today, unless you're the paid up sort of ideological member of the globalist cabal. But if you're not, then you've been determined as a political thought criminal enemy, and these people were considered the danger. Now, it's interesting that hooliganism was a real problem, and illegal behaviour. People knifing each other. There were beatings and muggings. There was hooliganism. There was a lot of legal problems at the street level. The people sort of killing each other and that sort of stuff. But the interesting thing, reading the views of the party heavyweights at the time, was that's not a threat to our power. That's not an ideological threat to our reshaping society. We don't want to spend the time on that. We don't care about that. And even to the point where if they did drag people into court and convict them, the courts that didn't have any political consideration associated with it were reasonably, like any court, the evidence was there. 3 people saw you do this, and that sort of stuff. So it wasn't a difficult thing. The evidence counted. But if you went into a political court, or you were part of the groups that were considered dangerous, the straight white males of the time, then you were perceived as ideologically impure, to the point where you would get a prison sentence simply for being in that group or that category. Now, the categories were people that had received a university education or even a senior high school education before the communist revolution there in 1917. So say people born before, before 1898, 1899, anybody born before that who had any sort of, they'd either owned a business, they'd been a manager in a private business, they'd had a college education, even if it was in a technical skill, such as metallurgy or something like that, were viewed with suspicion because they'd acquired some sort of prominence and success in the pre-communist days. Now, they were viewed as, well, you guys aren't going to really get anything out of this communist thing. It will benefit others and benefit the younger people coming through. It'll benefit the peasants. It'll benefit the downtrodden on the bottom. But you guys are actually doing pretty good. So this revolution will take things away from you. You're now on a lower salary than you were. You've got fewer things to buy, and your standard of living will decline, and has declined, and will continue to decline for the foreseeable future, for decades into the future. So there's nothing in it for you. So we don't think you're a reliable communist, a reliable Marxist. You're therefore a class enemy, because we know there's nothing in it for you. Now, that's a fairly realistic approach. Whether or not these people would all be enemies or something, that was quite another matter. But they were ideologically determined that given there's nothing in it for you, then you must be opposed to it, or at the very least very lukewarm about it. Therefore, you are an enemy of the people. So that was the rationale they applied, which is the same today, because for pretty much any straight white male that wasn't on the very bottom of society, globalization, other than a small handful that are in the globalist cabal, globalization is going to see, and already has seen, a savage reduction in standards of living, and an equally savage reduction in your prospects for the future, quality of life. Everything has gone backwards as a result of globalization. And the globalists know this. The globalists know that any straight white male who's finished senior high school, hasn't been divorced, or they know that your prospects are declining, your purchasing power is declining, you're becoming a minority in your own country, and you've got no other country you can go to. So they know that, and they know that your globalization offers nothing for you, and therefore they've predetermined and pre-classified you as an enemy. You're a white supremacist. You're a fascist. You're a Nazi. You're Hitler. Yeah, Hitler is everywhere. You're a Nazi. And so they sort of are preempting the obvious. Given there's nothing in this for you, given you were benefiting from the pre-globalization days, we will just declare you as an ideological enemy. And if you ask any questions, you protest, you don't like what's going on, we'll call you a Nazi, and we'll say that you're Hitler. And that's really and that's how the Soviet communists did. They just looked at who was not going to benefit from the communist revolution and said, well, you're a class enemy, you're a fascist. And well, they didn't use fascists back in the day, but so that's sort of how they went about things and they purposely wanted to deprive those people of opportunities within the new system. Now, contrary to sort of popular myth, this idea that everyone was paid the same and all this sort of thing, the communists tried various things to get production going. They wanted people to get further education, and so there were numerous courses available that were free that people could go to. Now, that was whether you want to become a tool setter or in metallurgy or operating, industrial equipment or anything. There were just numerous courses. Now, these courses weren't necessarily being run by people that themselves knew anything, and it's very ideologically driven. So we see the education system wasn't actually to educate in the sense that it once was, or to have any merit or any excellence. The idea was that if 100 people went to a course in metallurgy, that they would all be given a metallurgy certificate at the end of the day. But the Soviets placed great stock on education and continuing education. They always wanted people to be going to night school to ostensibly learn something. But as there was no sort of independent, impartial testing, or a bit of it patchy here and there, but generally there was no testing, and it was very much up to particular managers or party hacks and bureaucrats in areas. So this is again very similar to today, where the idea is you get as many low IQ moron kids and you stuff them into the university, but give them some easy course to do, and then make sure nobody fails. And this is viewed as getting them to have buy-in into this new utopian economy and re-engineered society you're creating. See, you've got a degree just like the guy who busted his ass and he's got an IQ of 5 million. You got an IQ of minus 5 million, didn't do any work, you don't know shit, but you got a degree as well, and that's equal to his. So this idea you create artificial equality by getting everyone the same outcome. This was also very much of this social re-engineering. And the idea of elitism, where the brightest people would rise to the top. I mean, that was viewed with great suspicion in as much as it would create people who had the confidence and the knowledge and the capability to be a threat to the ideological power of the party. It was seen that way. Again, we come back to straight white males in the West. They're the only ones capable of organising to be a threat to the globalist cabal. And the globalist knows. That's why they're constantly name calling. You're Nazis, you're Nazi, you're Hitler. It's the same almost childish, spiteful thing. But that's the Soviets, the Marxist Soviets in Russia. They saw that same thing, that we can't have capable people running things. We can have ideological fanatics, but we can't have people that are capable in their own right of being high achievers, because they will be the nucleus of a threat to our authority and also to the ideology, because people that are have substantial expertise in a given field, then that they don't need ideology is irrelevant. Doing the job is what's relevant, not the ideology. Whereas the Soviets were the other way around. The ideology is important. Getting the job done, well, that's desirable, but not as much as the ideology. And we see that again today. If you look at, say, the Biden administration in the United States, it's all about ideology. Getting the job done, who cares? It's ideology. And if we can get the ideology, the globalist controlled Biden administration, if we can get the ideology sort of in there, then the rest will somehow magically fall into place, which is very much how bureaucrats view the imposition of ideology. If we use the right language, if we put enough black lesbians in there, then it will all, utopia will just magically appear before our eyes. It's very much a sort of communist Marxist bureaucrat way of thinking. And the Soviets were doing that back in the 1920s. Now, the entire industrialization came out of the standard of living of the people. So it's not that hard to put up lots of factories, inefficient as they were, many of them with dirt floors, put up a lot of factories and that sort of stuff, and create a lot more factories when you're taking it out of the standard of living of the people. Now, salaries were different depending on what jobs you did. So if you had a job that ostensibly is more skilled, you could get higher pay. There wasn't much to spend it on, but there was sort of an inadvertent market economy, and probably more a black economy in many ways. It was given they brought so many people, just in the first 5 years of what they called the FiveYear Plan, sort of, 1922 to 1927, I guess, but they really shifted that a couple of years. So 1924 to 1929 really was that first 5-year plan, as it was called. But they were doing the 5-year plan, stumbling along really for a couple of years before they got into that, or a few years actually. So they moved something like 8.5 million people, peasants, from the rural areas to the city. Now they collectivized the farms, they killed off the kulaks, the successful farmers. And the kulaks really, they were still peasants, but they acquired larger tracts of land from the aristocrats simply because they were the better managers, they were the better farmers, and they were able to produce substantial surpluses, as in crops, surpluses that then would in turn enrich the aristocrats. So they were given, that peasant's doing really well with that 10 acres I gave them. I tell you what, I'll give them another 10 acres and see how they go. So these were just the if you like, the more effective managers, farmers, administrators, organisers, and they'd become a class of their own, and they'd use their extra position within the wider aristocracy of the nation at the time to build better houses. The houses of the other peasants were made of wood, for example, but theirs was made of cut stone and so on. So they had a better standard of living and a bigger house and private bedroom for the parents and so on. So now these were because there were a lot more people moving to the city, they needed more food for the city, and then the government instituted price controls to force the kulaks to sell their products cheaply, often at below the cost of growing it or making it. Now the kulaks didn't like that, and so they reduced the amount of grain that they were, the crops they were planting. the government then retaliated by requisitioning the amount of food they wanted anyway, that they needed for the cities, even if that meant that the kulaks had no seeds to plant for the following year, or that the local people would starve to death. Many of them did. Now, the Holodomor, as it's called, around Ukraine and a few parts of Russia, but effectively targeting the kulak peasants, they were supposed to have killed up to 20 million people through starvation and the wider effects of malnutrition, being susceptible to diseases and the like. But I used a few books as reference for this, and a couple of books in particular. They're quite sympathetic to the communist regime, and they insist, no, it wasn't 20 million, it was only 10.9 million died, and evil fascist propaganda saying 20 million, but it doesn't matter, it's 10 or 20 in the sense that the party sought to implement its ideology, and if that meant the death of tens of millions or 10 million or 20 million, whatever it was, it doesn't really matter. But we may take the lower figure, 10 million. Gee, that's bad enough, isn't it? People dying of starvation and disease from malnutrition. That was considered to be, they didn't. A few people sort of turned a hair at it. Nikita Khrushchev being one of them. But the reality was that was an acceptable bit of collateral damage to pay. We're moving ahead with the ideology. We're moving ahead with ideological plans. We're reshaping society, and if 10 million people have to die here or 5 million there, who cares? Who cares? We're going ahead with the ideology, and we see this brazen disregard for collateral damage. I mean, 10 million deaths in this case. Brazen disregard for collateral damage, as long as the ideology is going ahead, and we see this very much with the globalists today. Their apparatchiks and flunkies and goons. I mean, look at the people that the Biden administration is putting up for various government positions, and when they get questioned or interviewed by, say, a Senate committee in the United States, and you look at some of these people. I mean, seriously, fuck. Talk about ideological fanatics and low IQ flunkies and goons and hangers-on and parasites. It's completely ideological. I mean, if you even see one of these people that is either A, suited for the role, or is among the better qualified of those that could have been put forward, you just don't see any. I mean, it's scary. That's how fixated the globalists are with re-engineering Western society, and they're doing it through putting low IQ fanatics into key government posts and public service and so on. Now, I mentioned the education. Feeding people was also difficult. Now, some factories, there was a very high staff turnover in a lot of these newer factories, in fact, in any enterprise, and things would take quite a while to settle down. Now, when you're looking at a breakneck implementation of ideology, as they were there, then you would expect sort of churn and burn and these sorts of things, and that definitely was happening. Now, some factories were allocated their own farm, so they could provide a canteen food, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, for very affordable prices. Whereas factories that didn't have farms allocated to them, they had to buy food in using whatever means they could. Technically, there were price controls. The reality was that the more that the price controls were sort of imposed, the greater the shortage of the products became. So you had to go to the black market, or you had to buy inferior products or products that had partially spoiled. So in some factories, they had a real problem keeping workers because they couldn't supply food at the canteens. So the workers would then move to another factory, or want to at least to try and go to another factory where, for example, they had their own farms and so on. So the amount of money somebody had was pretty important. The scale of pay, again, it was meant to be going up based on skill levels. Inevitably, and when you've got ideology playing such a big role here, the ideology also played a very large factor, particularly where you'd have like political commissars or things like that. Now, the most people lived in pretty basic accommodation. Again, when you're moving that many millions of people into the cities like Moscow and so on, So you could have 40 people sharing one toilet, for example, or 40 people sharing one kitchen, and so you'd need to be very patient. You need to be be able to get on well with you, get on well with the people around you when you're in that sort of situation. But invariably, it didn't. It frequently flared up, and there'd be murders and muggings, knife fights and maimings and killings and all sorts of things like that. The government didn't really care about that. It seemed that's really interesting. That we don't care. A couple of people got murdered. Not interested. But if you oppose, if you're viewed as having, or it's seen as you're having views contrary to the ideology, now that is an issue. Send the secret police, arrest that motherfucker. And we see that again, here where Antifa and BLM rioters can burn things down and create all sorts of property damage, beat people up, murder people. And the government, the globalist controlled government doesn't really care. It's not desirable necessarily, but that's not the problem. The real problem is Nazis. And the Soviet government, the Marxist government, they had the same view. If you oppose our ideological power, we will kill you. But if you want to go murder a few people, engage in hooliganism, that sort of thing, don't really care. Now, even when people are convicted of crimes such as hooliganism, then and they're meant to do some sort of community service, which is really do overtime at the factory without pay. Those are really the penalties. And if you are ideologically or politically irrelevant, sometimes they wouldn't even bother with that. But there was also no follow-up. So say 10,000 people got convicted of things like causing serious injury to another person, suspected murder or hooliganism, these sorts of things, and yet only 2,000 or so would turn up to serve their sentences or to go to prison, that sort of thing. 8,000 just wouldn't bother. So because there was so much movement of people and so many people coming and going and changing address, they just give any fake address and or fake name or anything at all. I left my papers at home. This started to really change when people just couldn't move outside of their area. So you'd be allocated an area and you weren't allowed to move outside. But now we're already seeing that in the West here, the 15-minute cities. And there are places in the UK where if you travel outside of your zone, you have to pay a fine. And the same is in Russia. If you're outside of your zone that hadn't been approved by a special passport, then you would be you could be imprisoned for it or even shot as an ideological enemy, depending on who you were. So just looking at the social engineering, or coming back to that specifically, the shortage of labour for opening up all these factories so quickly meant that they had to put women in the factory. It wasn't a matter for debate or so on. They just had to do it. So they were bringing women in from the rural areas, or even women that lived in the city, and they were stuffing them into the factories to do industrial factory work. Again, often a dirt floor factory, no air conditioning or anything, colder than hell in winter and suffocatingly hot in summer, and these sorts of things. And these were the conditions that they worked in. So this is something that women, didn't really want to do. Now they used propaganda campaigns. Hey, women, you're being chained to the kitchen by your oppressor husband. Your husband is oppressing you. He's a Nazi. He's Hitler. But come into this dirt floor factory and work for shit money and so on. So they tried that, and that wasn't necessarily a huge success, although they certainly went hard at it with the propaganda there. And it also served the dual purpose of dividing families. So you could turn men against the women, and then you could say to the women, hey, why don't you inform on your husband and tell the secret police if he says this or does that, and we'll arrest the motherfucker and throw him in a special prison for political prisoners where he'll probably die. So and that created, again, a lot of social social descent. So the women were working in factories, and the women went from being almost 0% of the workforce, other than in the rural areas where they would obviously have been helping with farm work and stitching clothes and whatever. But in the cities, then they went to work in the factories, and something like 40% of women just within the space of a few years. So it went from zero, almost zero women working, to suddenly 40% in the space of a few years. That's how quickly that moved forward there. Just looking at the overall sort of success in changing society, there was certainly benefit for the peasants, but the peasants were mostly illiterate when the Soviets took over. Now they did address the lack of literacy, and school was universal and available for everybody. Technically, they had a universal health system, but they couldn't afford to buy medicines, and most there was lots of alternating vinegar and brown paper type sort of recommendations by doctors. Doctors were considered as part of the elite, or had hitherto been part of the elite. So doctors, it was considered to be more of a sort of a voluntary public service, and there were only a very small number of doctors that were considered to be acceptable members of the party, if you like. Whereas, school teachers, because they were propaganda, anyone who's a propagandist was well paid and well looked after, had a lot of benefits, had a better house and better access to food, all these sorts of things. And we see that today in the West. If you look at the people that peddle the globalist propaganda, or you look at the teachers and teachers unions and these sorts of things, these people are unusually well looked after in our current system today, because they're the propagandists in support of the globalist re-engineering society, the same as they were back then in the Soviet era. So we see the same sort of protected class, as in, you're the propagandist, you can tell any lie you want as long as it's in service of our ideology. And we see that today, of course, with the globalist cabal. So I could go on here for a while, but I think I'm illustrating the point that the methods and the devices and the controls and the levers and the switches and so on that the Soviet Marxist communists used to create this so-called utopia that they were aspiring to. It's, if not exactly the same, so close as to make no difference to how the globalists are going about it today. It's going to take the globalists a little bit longer, but they are on that same mission of socially re-engineering Western society without the consent of the people, and along strictly ideological lines. And they don't care about the collateral damage. And the enemies of their unwanted revolution are straight white males with an above average IQ. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.